What if the seven sages who appear in every ancient civilization weren't mythological figures invented to explain human achievement, but records of something that came before, teachers who arrived already knowing what humanity would spend millennia trying to remember? What if the reason these beings appear in Sumerian tablets, Egyptian temple walls, Indian scriptures, and Mesoamerican codices isn't cultural diffusion or shared archetypes, but shared inheritance? In the heat of southern Iraq, where sandstorms still erase footprints within hours, carved cylinders no larger than a thumb still preserve their images, robed figures emerging from water, from mountains, from the sky, carrying objects that look uncomfortably like the tools of instruction. These seals have waited in museum basements for over a century. The cuneiform beside them describes beings called Apkallu in Akkadian, Abgal in Sumerian, fish-cloaked sages who taught humanity everything it would later claim to have, invented. 5,000 years ago, scribes pressed these records into wet clay with a sense of urgency we can still feel in the depth of their impressions. The knowledge was already ancient to them, the warning was already fading. So before this story pulls you under, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you're drawn to histories that remember what we've been taught to forget. And if you're still listening, tell me in the comments where you are tonight, and what time the clock shows where you're resting. I'd like to imagine this quiet, stretching across continents as the past whispers through the darkness. In the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, behind reinforced glass and climate-controlled air, there sits a vessel carved from alabaster more than 5,000 years ago. And if you were to stand before it today, you would see something that troubles the neat timeline we have constructed for the birth of human civilization. The Uruk vase, as archaeologists have named it, rises, about 3 feet tall, and depicts in carved relief a procession of figures moving upward in registers toward a goddess at the top. And among the humans carrying offerings of grain and livestock, there appear other figures, robed differently, standing apart, their posture suggesting not worship but instruction. The vase is cracked from its long burial and from the chaos of more recent history, but it remains complete enough to ask its question clearly, and the question is this: who are the figures that appear neither fully human nor fully divine? And why do they appear in the oldest narrative art we have ever recovered from Mesopotamian soil? This would be curiosity enough if the pattern stopped here, but it does not stop here, and that is where the silence begins to hum with something like recognition. In Mesopotamia they were called the Apkallu, 7 sages who emerged from the waters before the flood and taught humanity everything it would later claim to have invented. In Greece they were remembered as the 7 sages, wise men whose teachings formed the foundation of philosophy and governance. In India they were the Saptarishi, the 7 seers who received the Vedas not through study but through direct transmission from a source beyond human origin. In China they appeared as legendary culture heroes who brought writing and agriculture and medicine to a population that had known none of these things. In Mesoamerica they emerged from the sea or descended from the sky, feathered and strange, teaching the calendar and the temple and the cultivation of maize before departing across the water with promises to return. 7 figures, 7 teachers, 7 foundations of everything we call civilization, appearing independently in cultures separated by oceans and millennia, each tradition insisting that what humanity knows was not discovered but delivered. The pattern should not exist. If these were local mythologies invented to explain cultural achievements, they should differ wildly in their particulars, reflecting the unique conditions of each civilization, but instead they converge on the same structure, the same number, the same claim that knowledge descended rather than emerged. And here is what makes the pattern genuinely difficult to dismiss. These figures do not appear late in the mythological development of these cultures, added retroactively to grant ancient authority to later institutions. They appear in the oldest layers. They are there from the beginning. When archaeologists excavate the earliest temples and recover the earliest tablets and translate the earliest texts, these 7 beings are already present, already described, already credited with having taught the very scribes who recorded their existence. The evidence does not show these figures emerging from simpler predecessor concepts. The evidence does not show gradual mythological development from nature spirits to culture heroes. The evidence shows them arriving fully formed in the oldest accessible strata of human literacy, waiting to be remembered by anyone who cared to look. This is not a claim about what these beings were. This is an observation about how they were recorded. Across every literate civilization we have excavated, the foundational texts do not describe humanity proudly inventing its own tools and systems. They describe humanity receiving instruction from beings it did not create and could not control. The Sumerian king lists do not begin with human kings. The Egyptian chronologies do not begin with human pharaohs. The Vedic hymns do not begin with human composers. They begin with something else, something that came before, something that taught and then withdrew. What follows in the hours ahead is not an argument but an exploration, a journey through 7 chapters examining 7 beings as they appear in the textual and archaeological record, asking not whether they were real in the way we understand reality, but why so many civilizations, knowing nothing of each other, preserved the same memory of teachers who arrived already knowing what they came to teach. What the texts preserve is not worship in the sense we usually mean. It is documentation. It is administrative. It is the same tone used to record grain stores and property transfers and legal judgments. And that tone, so clinical and so careful, is perhaps the strangest element of all, because mythology should sound like mythology, and this does not. In 1887, a peasant woman digging in the ruins of Tel El Amarna in Egypt uncovered a cache of clay tablets that should not have been there. The site was the abandoned capital of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, and the tablets she found were not Egyptian at all, but Mesopotamian, written in the wedge-shaped script called cuneiform that belonged to cultures 1,000 miles to the east. Among the diplomatic correspondence and royal letters that made up most of this archive, catalogued today in the British Museum under designations beginning with EA for El Amarna, there appeared fragments of something older and stranger, a mythological text that Babylonian scribes had copied and Egyptian scribes had preserved for reasons we can only guess. The tablet, now held under catalogue number EA356, measures roughly 6 inches across and contains on its surface a portion of what scholars call the Adapa myth. And within that myth appears the first detailed account of a figure who would haunt Mesopotamian memory for millennia. His name was Adapa, and he was the first of the 7 sages, the first of the Apkallu, the first of the beings who emerged from the waters to teach humanity everything it would later need to survive. The fact that this tablet was found in Egypt rather than Mesopotamia tells us something important about how seriously the ancient world took these stories. They were not local folklore confined to a single city or region. They were copied and transported and preserved across cultures, treated as documents of fundamental importance, the kind of knowledge a royal archive should contain even if the language required specialist translation. And what the tablet describes is not a god in the sense we usually imagine gods, not a figure demanding worship or performing miracles, but something closer to an instructor, a teacher sent from the realm of Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, to transmit to humanity the arts of civilization. The Akkadian word Apkallu breaks apart into components that reveal its meaning. Ab refers to water, and Gal means great, and the beings who bore this title were understood to be great ones of the water, figures who emerged from the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater ocean that the Mesopotamians believed lay beneath the earth. According to the texts that have survived across dozens of tablets and cylinder seals and temple inscriptions, there were 7 of these beings in the age before the Great Flood, 7 sages sent by Enki to teach humanity before the deluge wiped the first world clean. Their names have been preserved with the care usually reserved for royal genealogies. The first was Uana, whom the Greeks would later call Oannes. The second was Wanaduga. The third was Enmeduga. The fourth was Enmegalama. The fifth was Enmebulugga. The sixth was Aninlilda. And the 7th was Utuabzu, who ascended to heaven before the flood and thus escaped the destruction that ended the first age of the world. These were not abstract principles or symbolic personifications. They were named individuals with specific roles, recorded in lists that scribes copied and recopied across centuries with the same fidelity they applied to administrative records and legal contracts. And when Mesopotamian artists depicted them in the cylinder seals that served as personal signatures and magical protections, they gave them a form that still startles modern viewers. The Apkallu appear as figures wearing cloaks made from the skin of fish, the head of the fish rising above their human heads like a hood, the body of the fish trailing down their backs like a cape, their human hands visible beneath holding objects that look like implements of ritual or instruction. Some scholars interpret these as costumes worn by priests impersonating the sages in religious ceremonies. Others note that the texts describe the Apkallu as genuinely amphibious, emerging from the water each day to teach and returning to the sea each night, creatures who belonged to both realms and could move between them at will. What they taught forms a catalogue that matches almost exactly the foundations of Mesopotamian civilization itself. The Bit Meseri incantation texts, magical formulas designed to protect buildings and their inhabitants, list the gifts of the Apkallu in language that sounds less like mythology and more like a curriculum. They brought the knowledge of temple architecture, the sacred geometry that determined how ziggurats should rise, and how shrines of Hogpi should be oriented to the stars. They brought writing and calculation, the cuneiform script and the mathematical systems that allowed the first cities to track their stores and measure their fields. They brought astronomy and the calendar, the ability to predict the movements of planets and mark the turning of seasons with precision that still impresses modern scientists. They brought medicine and healing, the diagnostic procedures and herbal treatments recorded in tablets that read like ancient textbooks. They brought divination and dream interpretation, the arts of reading omens in the flight of birds and the shapes of oil on water. They brought laws and governance, the principles by which disputes could be settled and kings could rule with the authority of cosmic order. And they brought agriculture and irrigation, the techniques of channeling water and cultivating grain that allowed permanent settlements to survive in a landscape that would otherwise have remained hostile to human concentration. This is not a list of minor contributions, this is civilization itself, the entire package of knowledge and technique that separates settled urban culture from nomadic wandering. And the texts do not describe humanity gradually developing these arts through trial and error over centuries. They describe the arts arriving complete, delivered by beings who already knew them, taught during a single age before the flood washed the First World away. Here is where the archaeological record becomes uncomfortable. When we excavate the earliest Mesopotamian sites, when we uncover the first temples and the first administrative tablets, and the first examples of cuneiform writing, we do not find the expected developmental sequence. We do not find crude pictographs slowly becoming more abstract and systematic. We do not find simple counting systems gradually evolving into sophisticated mathematics. We do not find primitive star watching becoming rigorous astronomy through accumulated observation. Instead, we find these systems appearing already sophisticated, already systematic, already capable of expressing complex ideas and performing calculations that require conceptual frameworks which should have taken generations to develop. The cuneiform script in its earliest recoverable form already contains over 1,000 distinct signs capable of representing syllables and words and abstract concepts. The mathematical tablets already employ base 60 calculations that can handle fractions and squares and what we would now call algebraic relationships. The astronomical records already track the movements of Venus with precision that implies centuries of prior observation that left no archaeological trace. Mainstream scholarship explains this as an illusion created by incomplete evidence. The developmental stages existed, the argument goes, but they occurred in perishable media that did not survive, or in regions that have not yet been excavated, or in oral traditions that were never written down. This is possible. It may even be probable. But the Mesopotamians themselves offered a different explanation, and they repeated it with such consistency across such a span of time that dismissing it requires ignoring what the texts actually say. The Babylonian priest Berossus, writing around 290 BCE for a Greek audience that had conquered Mesopotamia under Alexander, composed a work called the Babyloniaca that summarized his civilization's memory of its own origins. Berossus had access to temple archives stretching back millennia, and he wrote not as a mythographer spinning tales, but as a historian compiling records. His original text is lost, but extensive quotations survive in later Greek and Roman authors who found his account too strange to ignore and too well-sourced to dismiss. And what Berossus described was this. In the first year of human history, a creature emerged from the Persian Gulf where it borders Babylonia. It had the body of a fish, but beneath the fish head was another head that was human, and beneath the fishtail were feet like those of a man. Its voice was human and articulate, and an image of it was preserved down to his own day. This creature, called Oans by the Greeks but Wana in the original texts, spent its days among humans teaching them everything they would need to know. It taught letters and sciences and arts of every kind. It taught them to found cities and establish temples and compile laws. It taught them the principles of geometry and how to distinguish the seeds of the earth. It taught them how to collect fruits and, in short, everything that pertains to civilized life. And when the sun set, the creature would plunge back into the sea and spend the night beneath the waves, for it was amphibious and belonged to both the water and the land. Other creatures of similar form appeared in subsequent generations, and Berossus named them and described what each added to human knowledge. But here is the claim that genuinely troubles historians who take these sources seriously. Berossus explicitly states that since the time of these creatures, nothing further has been discovered. The phrase sits there in the Greek quotations of his lost original, unambiguous and unsettling. Nothing further has been discovered. Everything humanity knows, everything that makes civilization possible, everything that separates us from animals living by instinct in the wilderness, was taught in that first age by beings who emerged from the water already knowing what they came to teach. The subsequent history of Mesopotamia, all the empires and conquests and libraries and monuments, is not a story of progress and discovery. It is a story of preservation and transmission, of scribes copying what earlier scribes wrote, of kings rebuilding temples according to ancient plans, of priests performing rituals whose meanings had become obscure, but whose forms could not be changed because they were inherited. From an age when teachers walked among students and knowledge flowed directly from source to recipient, this is not the boast of a proud civilization claiming to have invented what it actually borrowed from neighbours. This is the confession of inheritors who knew themselves to be custodians of something they did not create. The Greeks who conquered Mesopotamia found this claim remarkable, and they preserved it in their own writings because it offered an origin for wisdom that predated their own philosophers. The Church Fathers who came later found it troubling, because it suggested a source of knowledge outside the biblical framework, and they debated whether Oanna might have been a demon or an angel, or a distorted memory of antediluvian patriarchs. Modern scholars find it embarrassing, because it does not fit the model of cultural evolution we have constructed to explain how civilizations develop. But the Mesopotamians who originated the claim and preserved it across 3,000 years of literate history did not treat it as mythology requiring interpretation. They treated it as fact requiring documentation. They named the sages, they listed their teachings, they depicted their forms on seals that served as legal signatures, they invoked their authority in incantations meant to protect the living, and they never, across all those millennia of careful record-keeping, claimed to have surpassed what the fish-cloaked teachers had originally provided. If the Apkallu taught everything, as Berossus claimed, and as the older tablets seem to confirm, then the question becomes uncomfortable in its implications. Where did these beings learn what they came to teach? They emerged from the water already knowing. They arrived with a curriculum already complete. They transmitted and then they withdrew, returning to the sea or ascending to heaven, leaving humanity to preserve what it had been given without the teachers present to answer further questions. And perhaps even more troubling is this: why do beings fitting the same description, performing the same function, teaching the same arts, appearing in the same number, emerge independently in civilizations halfway around the world that had no contact with Mesopotamia and no access to its texts? The Apkallu are not unique. They are the local instance of a global pattern, and that pattern requires explanation. In 1849, a British adventurer and diplomat named Austin Henry Layard was excavating the ruins of ancient Nineveh near the modern city of Mosul when his workers broke through into a series of chambers that had been sealed for more than 2,000 years. What they found inside would transform our understanding of ancient civilization and burden scholars with a mystery that remains unresolved to this day. The chambers contained tablets, thousands upon thousands of clay tablets covered in the wedge-shaped cuneiform script, stacked on collapsed shelving and scattered across floors where they had fallen when the Assyrian Empire met its violent end in 612 BCE. The library belonged to Ashurbanipal, the last great king of Assyria, a ruler who prided himself not on conquest alone but on scholarship, and who had dispatched scribes across his empire with orders to copy every text of importance and bring the copies back to Nineveh for preservation. By the time the excavations concluded, more than 30,000 tablets and fragments had been recovered, representing the largest collection of ancient texts ever discovered in a single location. But here is what makes this discovery significant for our purposes. Ashurbanipal was a collector, not a creator. He did not commission new works, he gathered old ones, and the tablets his scribes copied were themselves copies of copies of copies, chains of transmission stretching back through centuries and millennia, towards sources the scribes themselves described as ancient beyond reckoning. The library was organised with a sophistication that still impresses modern archivists. Tablets were grouped by subject and stored in designated locations, with catalogue entries describing their contents and their origins. Medical texts occupied one section, astronomical tables another, legal codes another, still. And the catalogue entries themselves reveal something that complicates the standard narrative of human cultural development. The medical texts were not attributed to recent physicians or even to famous healers from Ashurbanipal's dynasty. They were attributed to the Apkallu, to the 7 sages who had taught before the flood, with specific texts assigned to specific sages, as though the catalogue were preserving not just the content but the chain of transmission from original teacher to eventual copyist. The astronomical tables were traced to observations made in ages so remote that the scribes used formulaic phrases, meaning before the flood or in ancient times, to indicate their origin. The legal codes claimed descent not from human legislators, but from original revelations delivered when kingship first descended from heaven. This is not how we expect ancient libraries to present themselves. We expect claims of recent discovery and royal patronage. We expect scribes crediting their contemporary sponsors and describing their own contributions to knowledge. Instead, we find scribes positioning themselves as custodians of an inheritance they did not create and dared not alter. The physical tablets provide evidence that supports this self-description in ways the scribes could not have anticipated. Many tablets include colophons, which are notes added by scribes at the end of texts describing the circumstances of copying. These colophons reveal the mentality of Mesopotamian scholarship more clearly than any other source. A typical colophon reads, "Copied from an old tablet and collided," meaning the scribe compared multiple source texts to produce the most accurate version possible. Others read, "Copied from a damaged tablet, the broken parts not filled in," meaning the scribe refused to guess at missing content even when the meaning seemed obvious. Still others read, "Written according to the original, may it not be changed," meaning the scribe understood his role as preservation rather than improvement. And scattered throughout the archive appear colophons that admit something remarkable. The scribe acknowledges that he has copied faithfully what he does not fully understand. The phrase appears in various forms across different tablets and different periods, but the meaning is consistent. The knowledge being transmitted exceeded the comprehension of those transmitting it. They copied anyway, because copying was a sacred duty, because the content was more important than the copyist, because allowing ancient knowledge to disappear through neglect was a failure more serious than admitting one's limitations. The medical corpus illustrates this pattern with particular clarity. The Diagnostic Handbook, spanning more than 40 tablets in its most complete form, presents a systematic classification of diseases organized by affected body part and symptom presentation. The text describes how to examine a patient, what questions to ask, what physical signs to observe, and what these observations indicate about the nature and prognosis of the illness. Modern physicians reading these texts recognize genuine clinical observation beneath the unfamiliar terminology. Descriptions of stroke, epilepsy, tuberculosis, and various infectious diseases appear in forms that remain diagnostically useful after 4,000 years. The surgical procedures describe wound treatment, abscess drainage, and other interventions that demonstrate practical anatomical knowledge. The pharmaceutical preparations list hundreds of plant, mineral, and animal substances with their therapeutic applications, and the tradition attributes the core of this knowledge not to centuries of accumulated trial and error by human healers, but to the sage Enmeduga, third of the 7 Apkallu, who taught medicine to humanity before the waters rose. The mathematical tablets present an even more striking puzzle. In the Yale Babylonian collection rests a small clay tablet, catalogued as Plimpton 3-2, dating to approximately 1800 BCE, and containing a table of numbers that mathematicians did not fully understand until the 20th century. The tablet lists what we now call Pythagorean triples, sets of 3 numbers that satisfy the relationship where the square of one equals the sum of the squares of the other 2. But this tablet predates Pythagoras by more than 1,000 years, and unlike the Greek tradition which presents the Pythagorean theorem as a discovery requiring proof and demonstration, the Babylonian tablet presents these relationships as known facts, entries in a reference table, practical tools for surveying and construction. There is no explanation of how the relationships were discovered. There is no proof that they are valid. There is only the assumption that anyone using the tablet already understands its application, because the knowledge was transmitted complete rather than derived from first principles. The base 60 mathematical system that underlies all Mesopotamian calculation presents the same pattern. We still use this system today every time we divide an hour into 60 minutes and a minute into 60 seconds, every time we divide a circle into 360 degrees and a degree into 60 arc minutes. But when we trace the system back through the archaeological record, we do not find a simpler base 10 system evolving into base 60 through practical refinement. We find base 60 appearing already developed in the earliest mathematical tablets, already capable of handling fractions and reciprocals and calculations that would be clumsy in any other base. Mathematicians have noted that base 60 has unusual properties. It is evenly divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, making it extraordinarily flexible for calculations involving division. But discovering these properties and designing a system to exploit them would require a level of mathematical sophistication that should itself require a long developmental period. Where is the evidence of that development? The tablets do not preserve it. They begin with sophistication already achieved. The astronomical records raise questions that grow more uncomfortable the more precisely we examine them. The mel.apin tablets preserve a star catalogue listing the rising dates of constellations throughout the year, the periods of planetary motion, and the methods for predicting celestial events. The Venus tablet of Amisaduqa, dating to approximately 1650 BCE, but claiming to record observations from the reign of a king who ruled around 1700 BCE, tracks the appearances and disappearances of Venus over a 21-year cycle with precision that modern astronomers have verified against their own calculations. But here is the difficulty. Achieving this precision requires not just careful observation over a single human lifetime, but continuous systematic recording over many generations. The cycles of Venus repeat with variations that can only be detected through comparison across decades. The relationship between lunar months and solar years requires centuries of observation to calibrate accurately. The prediction of eclipses demands tracking patterns that repeat on scales of 18 years or longer. The scribes who compiled these tablets could not have made all the observations themselves. They were working with data inherited from predecessors who were themselves working with inherited data. And when the tablets describe the origin of this astronomical tradition, they do not credit named human observers accumulating knowledge through patient centuries of star watching. They credit the age before the flood, when the sages were present and when the observations began. We have a choice in how we interpret this consistent pattern. We can assume that the Mesopotamians were systematically deceiving themselves and us, inventing mythological sources for knowledge they had actually developed through ordinary human effort over ordinary human time, disguising their own achievements behind a veil of imaginary antiquity for reasons we can only guess at. This interpretation preserves the standard model of cultural evolution, but requires us to dismiss what the texts actually say. Alternatively, we can take seriously the possibility that the Mesopotamians were describing their situation accurately, that they were indeed inheritors rather than inventors, that they were preserving rather than creating, that the sophistication we find in the earliest accessible layers of their culture was sophisticated because it arrived that way. This interpretation matches what the texts say, but raises questions that standard archaeology cannot easily answer. What we cannot do is ignore the consistency of the claim. Across thousands of tablets from hundreds of sites spanning more than 2 millennia of Mesopotamian literacy, the pattern holds. Knowledge is described as received. Sources are traced to ages before memory. Scribes position themselves as links in a chain that began with teachers who were not human. The language is the language of custody, not creation. The posture is the posture of stewardship, not innovation. And the colophons that admit confusion while insisting on faithful copying suggest that the scribes took their role seriously enough to preserve what they could not comprehend, rather than risk losing it through neglect or alteration. What if they were telling the truth about where their knowledge came from? The question is not rhetorical, it demands engagement. If the Apkallu were mythological constructs invented to lend authority to human achievements, why maintain the fiction so rigorously across so many centuries? Why not eventually claim credit for the developments that made Mesopotamia great? Why continue attributing mathematical innovations to beings who had supposedly lived before the flood when taking credit would have served royal propaganda far more effectively? The Mesopotamian record is extraordinary in its depth and its consistency, but it's not unique. The same pattern of inherited knowledge, of teachers from a previous age, of civilization arriving as gift, rather than emerging as achievement, appears in cultures that had no contact with Mesopotamia and no access to its texts. And if we are to understand what this pattern means, we must follow it across the ancient world to see whether the consistency holds. The next chapter of our journey takes us to Egypt, where a different civilization with different gods and different writing preserved the same memory of a time when those who knew more than humans walked among those who needed to learn. In the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, preserved behind glass in a climate-controlled gallery, there rests a fragment of black basalt that contains within its carved surface a timeline that should not exist according to conventional chronology. The Palermo stone, named for the Sicilian city where the largest fragment now resides, though pieces are scattered across multiple museums, dates to approximately 2400 BCE and preserves royal annals that reach backward through time far beyond what we consider the beginning of Egyptian history. The stone lists kings and their reigns year by year, recording the major events of each reign in the methodical style of administrative record-keeping. But when we trace the chronology backward, past the first dynasty and past the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt around 3100 BCE, the list does not stop. It continues into an earlier era, naming rulers who were not human pharaohs but gods, and between the age of divine rule and the age of human monarchy, it names a transitional period governed by beings called the Shemsu Hor, which translates as the followers of Horus. The Turin King list, a papyrus dating to the reign of Ramesses II around 1250 BCE, preserves a similar chronology in even greater detail. Though the papyrus is badly damaged, with many sections missing or illegible, enough survives to confirm the pattern. Before the first human dynasty, the list records the reign of the gods themselves, with Ptah and Ra and Shu and Geb and Osiris and Set and Horus, each governing Egypt for periods measured in centuries or millennia. Then comes a transitional period of demigods or spirits, and then the Shemsu Hor. And only after these intermediate ages does the list arrive at Menes, whom Greek historians called the first pharaoh, and whom modern archaeology tentatively identifies with the historical king Narmer. The total span of time covered by this divine and semi-divine chronology exceeds 30,000 years in some calculations, a duration that places the beginning of Egyptian civilization deep in the Pleistocene, in an era when conventional archaeology insists no civilization existed anywhere on Earth. Mainstream Egyptology treats these chronologies as mythology rather than history, symbolic genealogies designed to connect human pharaohs to divine ancestors and thereby legitimate their rule. This interpretation is reasonable and perhaps correct, but it does not address the specificity of the records or the consistency with which Egyptian sources describe the Shemsu Hor as a distinct category of beings who are neither the gods themselves nor ordinary humans. The term Shemsu Hor appears in texts spanning more than 2,000 years of Egyptian literacy, and the descriptions remain remarkably stable. These were beings who served Horus, who possessed knowledge that would later be attributed to the gods, who bridged the gap between an age when divine presence was direct and an age when humans governed themselves with only memory and ritual to connect them to cosmic order. They were associated with specialized technical knowledge, particularly astronomy and architecture, and the sacred sciences that allowed temples to be oriented correctly and rituals to be performed at proper times, and they were described as having lived in an era so remote that even the earliest dynastic Egyptians regarded them as ancient. The building texts of Edfu provide the most detailed account of what these predecessor beings were believed to have accomplished. The Temple of Horus at Edfu, constructed during the Ptolemaic period between 237 and 57 BCE, contains inscriptions that describe not just the temple's immediate construction, but its mythological origins in a time before the current world existed. These inscriptions speak of a primordial island that emerged from the waters of chaos, where the first sacred structures were built according to plans delivered by beings called the Builder Gods or the Sages. The texts describe how knowledge of sacred architecture was preserved through a great catastrophe, a period when the waters rose and destroyed the original homeland, and how survivors carrying this knowledge re-established the principles of temple construction in the world that emerged after the flood. The Edfu texts explicitly state that later temples, including the one on whose walls these words were carved, were built according to the ancient writings, following plans that had been transmitted across ages of destruction and reconstruction. The priests who composed these inscriptions did not claim to have invented the sacred architecture of Egypt. They claimed to have inherited it from sources so old that even the gods they worshipped were relatively recent inheritors in the chain of transmission. The inventory. Stela presents evidence that becomes controversial precisely because its implications are difficult to reconcile with standard chronology. This limestone stela was discovered in the 19th century near the Great Sphinx at Giza, and its text appears to date from the reign of Khufu, the pharaoh credited with building the Great Pyramid around 2560 BCE. But the stela's content describes Khufu not as the builder of the Sphinx, but as its restorer. The text indicates that Khufu found the Sphinx already present, already ancient, already requiring repairs that he undertook as an act of piety toward monuments inherited from earlier ages. The stela also describes the Temple of Isis as standing near the Sphinx, stating that Khufu discovered this temple beside the monument of the Sphinx, and that both structures predated his reign. Mainstream Egyptology dismisses the inventory stela as a later forgery, or a piece of pious fiction produced by priests who wished to enhance the antiquity of the Giza complex. This may be correct. The stela's authenticity is genuinely disputed, and its claims cannot be verified through other sources. But what the stela demonstrates, regardless of its date of composition, is that Egyptians themselves told stories about their monuments being older than the dynasties credited with building them. Whether the stela was carved during Khufu's reign or 1,000 years later, it reflects a tradition in which the great monuments of Egypt were understood as inheritances rather than achievements, restorations rather than original constructions. The concept that underlies all of these traditions is what the Egyptians called Zep Tepi, which translates as the first time or the first occasion. Zep Tepi was not simply a creation myth comparable to the opening chapters of Genesis or the Babylonian Enuma Elish. It was a foundational concept that shaped how Egyptians understood their entire civilization. Zep Tepi referred to a specific era, a golden age at the beginning of time when the gods themselves walked on Egyptian soil, when the principles of cosmic order called a Ma'at were established in their pure and original form, when the templates for all later development were first laid down. Everything that came after, Zep Tepi was understood as an attempt to maintain or restore or remember what had been established in that original age. Pharaohs did not innovate, they preserved. Priests did not discover, they transmitted. Architects did not invent, they built according to ancient plans. The entire civilization was oriented backward, toward a source of perfection in the past rather than a goal of progress in the future. The invention of writing itself was attributed to this original age. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing and calculation, was said to have created the hieroglyphic script and delivered it to humanity as a gift complete in itself. The Egyptians did not describe themselves as gradually developing their writing system from simple pictographs to complex phonetic script. They described receiving it whole from a divine source, and the archaeological evidence is at least ambiguous on this point. Egyptian hieroglyphics appear in the archaeological record already sophisticated, already capable of expressing complex grammatical relationships and abstract concepts, without the expected developmental sequence of simpler systems evolving toward complexity. This may reflect gaps in our evidence rather than genuine absence of development, but it matches what the Egyptians themselves claimed about the origin of their script. Within this framework of inherited knowledge and divine foundation, we encounter a pattern that connects unexpectedly to our examination of the Mesopotamian tradition. The 7 Hathors appear in Egyptian texts as a group of divine beings associated with fate and destiny, present at moments of birth and transition, possessing knowledge of what was to come and the power to influence outcomes. They are depicted in temple reliefs and described in magical texts, and while their function differs from the Apkallu of Mesopotamia, their number is identical. 7 beings, associated with specialized knowledge, appearing at crucial moments of transition between ages or states of being. The number 7 recurs throughout Egyptian sacred tradition in contexts that suggest deliberate significance rather than coincidence. 7 was the number of completion, the number of cosmic cycles, the number of stages in various initiatory and transformative processes. Whether this numerical pattern indicates direct connection to Mesopotamian tradition or independent emergence of the same structural principle remains unclear, but the consistency demands acknowledgement even if it resists explanation. The pyramid texts provide our earliest window into Egyptian religious thought, carved on the walls of pyramids dating to approximately 2400 to 2300 BCE. These texts are not narratives but ritual utterances, spells and declarations designed to ensure the successful transition of the deceased pharaoh to the afterlife. But embedded within these ritual formulas are references to events and beings and astronomical phenomena that appear to predate the texts themselves by considerable margins. The pyramid texts mention the Shem-Suhor. They reference the age of the gods. They contain astronomical alignments and stellar references that some researchers have argued encode knowledge of precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the positions of stars relative to the equinoxes to shift over cycles of approximately 26,000 years. If these arguments are correct, and they remain disputed within mainstream scholarship, then the pyramid texts preserve astronomical knowledge that would have required centuries or millennia of careful observation to accumulate, knowledge that the texts attribute to ages before the pyramids themselves were built. The question of precession is particularly significant because it was not officially discovered by Western science until the Greek astronomer Hipparchus described it around 127 BCE. If Egyptian texts from 2,000 years earlier encode precessional knowledge, either the Egyptians independently discovered what Hipparchus would later describe, or they inherited knowledge from sources with access to observational data spanning timeframes far longer than conventional Egyptian civilization. The astronomical alignments of Egyptian monuments add weight to these questions without resolving them. The Great Pyramid at Giza aligns to true north with precision that modern surveyors acknowledge as remarkable. The internal shafts of the pyramid point towards specific stars that occupied significant positions in the Egyptian sky during the pyramid's construction, or perhaps during an earlier era whose astronomical configuration the builders wished to commemorate. The Sphinx faces due east, greeting the rising sun on the equinoxes, and some researchers have argued that its lion form commemorates the age of Leo, a precessional era that ended around 10,000 BCE, long before conventional Egyptology places the monument's construction. These arguments are controversial and rejected by most mainstream scholars, but they illustrate the persistent sense that Egyptian monuments encode knowledge that exceeds what we expect from their supposed dates of construction. What emerges from this examination of Egyptian sources is a pattern that mirrors what we found in Mesopotamia, while differing in its specific details. Both civilizations describe an age before human rule, when beings of greater knowledge and power established the foundations of civilization. Both describe a transitional period when semi-divine figures bridged the gap between the age of gods and the age of men. Both attribute their most sophisticated knowledge to inheritance from these earlier ages rather than development through human effort. Both mention a catastrophic flood that marked the transition between eras. Both describe their role as custodians of ancient wisdom rather than creators of new achievement, and neither civilization, despite millennia of literacy and scholarship, ever claimed to have surpassed what had been delivered in that original age. The significance of this parallel becomes greater when we consider the lack of documented contact between Egypt and Mesopotamia during their formative periods. By the time of the later Bronze Age, around 1500 to 1200 BCE, we have clear evidence of diplomatic and commercial exchange between these civilizations, including the Amarna letters that contained Mesopotamian texts in an Egyptian archives. But the traditions we are examining appear in the earliest accessible layers of both cultures, in texts and concepts that predate any documented contact. Either these civilizations developed identical frameworks for understanding their own origins independently, or they inherited these frameworks from a common source that predates both of them, or there existed contact and exchange in periods for which we have not yet found evidence. None of these possibilities is comfortable, and none can be definitively established with current evidence. But the pattern holds, and it continues to hold as we follow it eastward, across mountains and deserts to the ancient civilization of India, where the same structure appears in texts that claim even greater antiquity than anything found in Egypt or Mesopotamia. In the libraries and temples of India, there exist texts that claim an antiquity so vast it makes the Egyptian and Mesopotamian records seem recent by comparison. And while scholars debate the actual dates of their composition, the texts themselves insist they were not composed at all, but received, transmitted from sources that existed before human memory began to keep count. The Rig Veda stands as the oldest of these texts, a collection of over 1,000 hymns addressed to divine powers, and it holds the distinction of being the oldest surviving text in any Indo-European language, the linguistic family that includes Sanskrit and Greek and Latin, and most of the languages spoken across Europe and Western Asia today. Orthodox scholarly dating places the Rig Veda's composition between 1500 and 1200 BCE, making it roughly contemporary with the later phases of Egyptian and Mesopotamian literacy. But this dating has never been comfortable, and the discomfort grows more acute the more carefully we examine what the texts actually contain. The Rig Veda includes references to astronomical configurations that some researchers argue could only have been observed thousands of years earlier than the conventional dates allow. It describes geographical features, most notably a great river called the Saraswati, that had ceased to exist in the form described long before 1500 BCE, and it consistently presents itself not as a new composition, but as an ancient inheritance, knowledge that was already old when the first human seers received it, already complete when the first hymns were memorized and transmitted. The tradition names 7 original seers who received this knowledge, and their names have remained stable across more than 3,000 years of continuous textual tradition: Marichi, Atri, Angiras, Pulastya, Pulaha, Kratu, and Vasishtha. These are the Saptarishi, the 7 sages, and in Indian tradition they occupy a position remarkably similar to the Apkallu of Mesopotamia and the Shemsu Hor of Egypt. They are not gods themselves, but they are not ordinary humans either. They exist in a category between figures who received divine knowledge and transmitted it to humanity, bridges between an age of direct divine presence and the current age when humans must rely on inherited texts and practices to connect with cosmic order. The stars of Ursa Major, the constellation we call the Big Dipper, are named after these 7 sages in Indian astronomical tradition, and they circle the pole star eternally, visible from any point in the northern hemisphere, a celestial reminder of beings who are believed to have lived in ages beyond memory. The knowledge attributed to the Saptarishi is not presented as their invention or discovery. The Sanskrit term used for the Vedas is a Paurashaya, which means not of human origin. The texts are explicit on this point. The rishis were seers, not authors. The Sanskrit root of the word rishi itself means to see, and what the 7 sages saw was knowledge that already existed, eternal truths embedded in the structure of reality that human minds could perceive but could never create. The Rig Veda was not composed in the way a poet composes verses. It was received in the way a radio receives signals, transmitted from a source beyond human origination through minds capable of perceiving what was already there. This is not a minor theological point or a poetic conceit. It is the foundational claim of Vedic tradition, insisted upon across millennia, shaping how the texts were preserved and transmitted in ways that have no parallel in other literate civilizations. Because the Vedas were considered divine in origin, every syllable was sacred, and the methods developed to preserve them were designed to prevent any change whatsoever across generations of transmission. The knowledge categories attributed to this original revelation span the full range of what we would call civilization. The astronomical precision of Vedic calendars reflects mathematical sophistication that should have required centuries of systematic observation to develop. The Vedic calendar tracks lunar months and solar years with corrections that account for the subtle discrepancies between different astronomical cycles, and it does so using techniques that appear in the earliest accessible texts already complete. The medical knowledge codified in Ayurveda, though compiled in its current form in later centuries, traces its origins to revelations received by the original sages, and it presents a systematic understanding of human physiology, disease classification, and treatment protocols that continues to be practiced across South Asia today. The architectural principles of Vastu Shastra, governing the orientation and proportion of sacred and domestic structures, claim derivation from the same primordial revelation, and temples built according to these principles align with astronomical phenomena in ways that require precise understanding of celestial mechanics. The grammatical analysis of Panini, composed around the 4th century BCE but systematizing principles considered far older, remains so sophisticated that modern linguists use it as a model for computational linguistics and formal language theory. The metallurgical knowledge evident in objects like the Iron Pillar of Delhi, which has stood exposed to the elements for over 100 years without significant rust, demonstrates mastery of techniques that modern material scientists are still working to fully understand. None of this knowledge is presented as human achievement. All of it is traced to the original revelation received by beings who existed before the current age of the world. The structure of time itself in Vedic cosmology mirrors the pattern we have observed in Mesopotamia and Egypt. The universe moves through vast cycles called yugas, ages of declining quality and increasing distance from the divine source. The first age, Satya Yuga, was an era of truth and direct divine presence, when the gods walked among beings and knowledge flowed without obstruction from its eternal source. The subsequent ages, Treta Yuga and Dvapara Yuga, witnessed progressive decline, increasing ignorance, and growing distance between humanity and divine reality. The current age, Kali Yuga, is the age of darkness, the era of maximum distance from truth, when what was once directly perceived must now be laboriously preserved through text and ritual, when the gods no longer appear visibly, when knowledge that was once universal has shrunk to fragments maintained by lineages struggling against the tide of forgetting. This structure precisely parallels the Mesopotamian pattern of pre-flood rulers with impossibly long reigns giving way to post-flood rulers with progressively shorter and more human lifespans. It parallels the Egyptian memory of divine rulers followed by demigods followed by human pharaohs, each age more limited than the one before. Across these three civilizations, geographically separated and linguistically distinct, we find the same temporal architecture, a golden age of divine presence, a catastrophic transition, and a current era defined by inheritance of diminished fragments from a greater original whole. The flood tradition appears in Vedic sources as explicitly as it does in Mesopotamian texts. The story of Manu, preserved in the Shatapatha Brahmana and later Puranic texts, describes a sage who receives warning of an approaching deluge from a divine fish, who builds a boat according to precise instructions, who survives the destruction that wipes away the previous world, and who becomes the progenitor of humanity in the age that follows. The parallels to the Mesopotamian flood narratives are too detailed to dismiss as coincidence. Manu loads the boat with seeds and with the 7 rishis, who survive alongside him, to transmit the Vedic knowledge to the world that emerges when the waters recede. The flood marks the transition between ages, the moment when direct divine presence withdraws and humanity must rely on what was preserved through the catastrophe. And what was preserved, according to the tradition, was not created by the survivors but received by them from an earlier age, maintained through the deluge, and transmitted forward to subsequent generations who would add nothing but only struggle to retain what had been given. The transmission itself became a sacred act, and the methods developed to ensure accurate preservation have no parallel in any other literate civilization. Each rishi founded a lineage called a gotra, and members of each gotra maintained responsibility for specific portions of the Vedic corpus. The texts were not merely memorized but embedded in the physical bodies of the transmitters through techniques that modern memory researchers find remarkable. The Vedic recitation traditions prescribe exact pronunciation, exact accent, exact rhythm, with methods of verification that require reciting the texts forward and backward, word by word and syllable by syllable, with interlocking patterns designed to catch any deviation before it can propagate to subsequent generations. For over 3,000 years, these techniques maintained texts that, when finally written down, proved to be essentially identical across lineages, separated by vast distances and centuries of time. This is not ordinary memorization. This is industrial-grade preservation technology, developed by people who understood that what they carried was irreplaceable, and who structured their entire social organization around ensuring its survival. The Saraswati River presents evidence that pushes against the comfortable conventional dating in ways that specialists have debated for over a century. The Rig Veda celebrates the Saraswati as the greatest of rivers, mighty in flood, flowing from the mountains to the sea, nourishing the lands through which it passed. But when modern geologists and hydrologists examined the region where the Saraswati was said to have flowed, they found a dry riverbed, the Gaga-Hakra Channel, which had not carried significant water for thousands of years. Satellite imagery and geological analysis have confirmed that a major river did once flow through this course, fed by Himalayan tributaries that have since shifted to other channels or dried up entirely. The best estimates for when this river ceased to flow in the manner described in the Rigveda cluster around 1900 BCE, with some researchers placing the major desiccation event even earlier. If the Rigveda describes the Saraswati as mighty and flowing, and if that description reflects observation rather than myth, then the portions of the text containing these descriptions must predate the river's drying. This pushes Vedic composition earlier than the orthodox 1500 to 1200 BCE dating allows, earlier than is comfortable for scholars who have built chronologies on the assumption that Vedic civilization entered India from the northwest during the second millennium BCE. The Saraswati evidence does not prove that the Vedas are vastly older than conventional scholarship claims. Rivers can be remembered long after they cease to flow, and poetic traditions can preserve memories of geographical features that have changed. But the evidence does suggest that the Vedic tradition was engaging with a landscape that existed before the forms we can archaeologically document, and it does support the tradition's own claims that the knowledge it preserves is older than the cultures through which it has been transmitted. We have now examined three major civilizations, Mesopotamia and Egypt and India, and in each we have found the same pattern: 7 beings associated with the transmission of civilizational knowledge, an age of divine presence followed by catastrophic transition, flood traditions marking the boundary between eras, and a consistent self-presentation as inheritors of ancient wisdom rather than creators of new achievement. The cultures differ in their languages and their specific mythologies, and their artistic traditions and their social structures. But the deep architecture is identical, knowledge descending from non-human sources through semi-divine intermediaries to human custodians who preserve but do not originate, who transmit but do not innovate, who understand their role as maintaining a connection to a source that existed before them and will be needed by those who come after. The pattern should not appear independently across civilizations that had no contact during their formative periods. Mesopotamia and Egypt were separated by deserts and political barriers during the earliest phases of their development. India was separated from it both by mountain ranges and vast distances. Yet the same structure appears in each: the same number of sages, the same temporal architecture, the same emphasis on inheritance rather than invention. Either this represents an extraordinary coincidence of independent cultural evolution, or it represents preservation of a common inheritance from a source that predates the divergence of these traditions, or it represents something else entirely that we do not yet have the categories to describe. The pattern continues as we turn our attention to civilizations even more isolated than these three. Civilizations separated not just by mountains and deserts, but by oceans. Civilizations that conventional archaeology insists had no contact with the Old World until European ships arrived in the 15th and 16th centuries. If the pattern holds in the Americas, if the same structure appears among the Maya and the Aztecs, and the Inca, then the coincidence hypothesis becomes strained beyond plausibility, and we must begin to consider explanations that the standard model of human development does not easily accommodate. Across the Atlantic Ocean, separated from the civilizations of the Old World by thousands of miles of open water that conventional archaeology insists was not regularly crossed until 1492, there existed cultures that preserved the same pattern we have now traced through Mesopotamia and Egypt and India. The coincidence, if coincidence it is, becomes more difficult to explain with each parallel we uncover, and the parallels in Mesoamerica are so specific and so numerous that they have troubled researchers since the first Spanish chroniclers began recording what they found in the temples and codices of the conquered peoples. The figure of Quetzalcoatl stands at the center of this mystery, a deity whose name means feathered serpent in the Nahuatl language of the Aztecs, but whose presence extends far beyond Aztec civilization, appearing in various forms across Mesoamerican cultures spanning more than 2,000 years. Quetzalcoatl was not primarily a god of nature or warfare or fertility in the way we might expect of deities in agricultural societies. He was a teacher, a culture hero, a bringer of civilization who arrived from across the Eastern Sea, bearing gifts of knowledge that transformed the peoples who received him. The Spanish chroniclers recorded what the Aztec priests told them about this figure, and the accounts are remarkably consistent. Quetzalcoatl brought writing and the calendar, he taught architecture and agriculture, he established laws and rituals, and then he departed, sailing east across the ocean on a raft of serpents with a promise that he would one day return. The direction of his departure matters. He came from the east and returned to the east across the water toward the direction of the old world civilizations we've already examined. And his role as teacher of civilizational arts mirrors precisely what the Mesopotamians said of the Apkallu, and what the Indians said of the Saptarishi. He did not invent what he taught. He delivered it, complete and systematic, to peoples who preserved it after his departure. The Olmec civilization presents the foundation layer of this Mesoamerican mystery. Appearing around 1500 BCE in the tropical lowlands of what is now southern Mexico, the Olmec represent the earliest major civilization in the Americas, and they appear with a suddenness that echoes what we observed in Mesopotamia. There is no gradual development visible in the archaeological record, no sequence of increasingly complex villages evolving toward urban sophistication. Instead, the Olmec appear already capable of monumental construction, already producing art of extraordinary refinement, already operating within a symbolic and ceremonial system of considerable complexity. The colossal stone heads for which they are famous, massive basalt sculptures depicting faces with distinctive features weigh up to 50 tons each, and were transported from quarries more than 50 miles distant through swamps and forests without the benefit of wheels or draft animals. The earthworks at sites like La Venta and San Lorenzo represent engineering achievements that required coordinated labour forces and sophisticated planning. And the iconography that appears on Olmec artifacts includes elements that would persist through a Mesoamerican civilization for the next 3,000 years, suggesting that the Olmec did not invent this symbolic vocabulary, but transmitted it, like the scribes of Mesopotamia, from sources they themselves regarded as prior. The calendrical systems of Mesoamerica present evidence that resists easy explanation through conventional models of cultural development. The Maya calendar, the most sophisticated timekeeping system developed anywhere in the ancient world, tracks multiple interlocking cycles, simultaneously, a 2-day sacred calendar, a 3-day solar calendar, and the long count, which measured time across spans exceeding 5,000 years. The accuracy of Maya astronomical calculations exceeds what European astronomers achieved until the modern era. The length of the solar year as calculated by Maya astronomers matches modern measurements to within seconds. The cycles of Venus were tracked with precision that implies centuries of continuous observation, with tables predicting the planet's appearances and disappearances over periods spanning generations. The question that emerges from this precision is uncomfortable. Where did the Maya observe for long enough to accumulate the data necessary for these calculations? The Maya civilization as archaeologically documented begins around 2000 BCE, but the observational foundation for their astronomical achievements seems to require data from periods substantially earlier. Either the Maya inherited astronomical knowledge from predecessor cultures whose observations they incorporated, or they developed methods of calculation so sophisticated that limited observation could yield accurate results, or there is something about the origin of their knowledge that we do not yet understand. The Popol Vuh, the creation narrative of the Quiché Maya, preserved in a colonial-era manuscript but clearly recording far older oral traditions, describes a history of the world that parallels the Mesopotamian and Vedic accounts in structure, if not in detail. According to the Popol Vuh, the current humanity is not the first attempt at creation, but the fourth. Previous ages produced beings that proved unsatisfactory to the creators. First animals that could not speak properly, then humans made of mud who dissolved in water, then humans made of wood who were destroyed in a great flood when they proved ungrateful and spiritually hollow. The current humanity, made from maize, is the successful version, but the narrative makes clear that this success was achieved only after multiple catastrophic failures, each ending in destruction that wiped away what came before. The flood that destroyed the wooden people is described in terms that echo the Mesopotamian and biblical accounts: waters rising to cover the earth, survivors escaping through divine favor, a world rebuilt from fragments preserved through catastrophe. The temporal architecture is identical to what we found in the Old World, ages of greater power and presence giving way through cataclysm to ages of diminished capacity and increased distance from divine sources. South of the Maya, in the Andean highlands, the Inca preserved traditions of Viracocha, a creator deity whose story parallels the Mesoamerican and Old World patterns with suspicious precision. According to Inca tradition, Viracocha emerged from Lake Titicaca in the aftermath of a great flood that had destroyed an earlier world. He created the sun and moon and stars, and he travelled across the Ahed, land-teaching civilization to the peoples he encountered. He taught agriculture and architecture, law and religion, the arts that separate civilized existence from animal survival. And when his teaching mission was complete, he departed across the Pacific Ocean, walking on the waters toward the west, promising to return in a future age. The companions who travelled with Viracocha in some versions of the tradition numbered 7, and they assisted in his teaching mission, spreading across different regions to establish the principles of civilization in multiple locations simultaneously. 7 teachers, arriving after a flood, bringing complete civilizational knowledge, then departing across the sea. The pattern has now appeared in Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, Mesoamerica, and South America, in civilizations separated by oceans and millennia of development. The number 7 recurs throughout Mesoamerican tradition, with a frequency that suggests deliberate significance rather than random occurrence. The Aztec migration narrative describes 7 tribes emerging from 7 caves at Chicamozdoc, a place whose name literally means the place of 7 caves. The 7 tribes wandered through ages of hardship before reaching the Valley of Mexico and establishing the civilization that the Spanish would encounter and destroy. The underworld in Mesoamerican cosmology was structured in 7 levels, requiring the souls of the dead to pass through 7 challenges or stages on their journeys to final rest. 7 appears in ritual calendars, in ceremonial structures, in the organization of temples and cities. We might dismiss this as numerological coincidence, as the human tendency to organize experience around symbolically significant numbers, but the recurrence of specifically 7 in cultures that independently associated 7 with primordial teachers of civilization strains the boundaries of coincidence. 7 Apkallu in Mesopotamia, 7 Saptarishi in India, 7 Hathors in Egypt, 7 caves of origin in Mesoamerica, 7 companions of Viracocha in the Andes. The number demands explanation even if we cannot provide one with certainty. Archaeological anomalies across the Americas suggest that the civilizations documented by historians were not necessarily the first sophisticated cultures to occupy these lands. Pumapunku, a site near Lake Titicaca in Bolivia, contains stonework of such precision that the blocks fit together with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters, cut at angles and in shapes that should require technology the pre-Columbian Andeans supposedly did not possess. The Nazca lines in Peru, vast geoglyphs depicting animals and geometric patterns visible only from the air, imply a planning capacity and possibly an aerial perspective that we do not associate with ancient cultures. Poverty Point in Louisiana, a massive earthwork complex dating to approximately 1700 BCE, demonstrates engineering sophistication that predates anything else known in North America by more than 1,000 years and appears with no clear developmental sequence leading up to it. These sites do not prove that lost civilizations existed or that transoceanic contact occurred. Each has been explained within conventional frameworks, attributed to the ingenuity of local populations working with available technology over long periods. But they contribute to a pattern of unexplained sophistication appearing in places and times that the standard model struggles to accommodate, and they raise questions about what might have existed before the civilizations we can document. The debate over how to explain these parallels has raged for over a century and remains unresolved. Mainstream archaeology favors independent invention. Different cultures facing similar challenges developed similar solutions, and the apparent parallels reflect convergent evolution rather than contact or common inheritance. This explanation preserves the standard model, but requires us to accept remarkable coincidences, not just in broad structural features but in specific details like the number 7 and the flood transition and the emphasis on received rather than invented knowledge. Alternative theories propose transoceanic contact, arguing that ancient seafarers crossed the oceans and carried civilizational knowledge between continents. This explanation accounts for the parallels, but faces the challenge of limited material evidence for such contact and the difficulty of explaining how knowledge could be transmitted across such distances without leaving more obvious archaeological traces. A third possibility exists that neither mainstream nor alternative theories adequately address. The parallels might reflect inheritance from a common source that predates the divergence of the cultures we can document, a source that was itself destroyed or transformed in the catastrophic events that all these traditions describe. If a sophisticated culture existed, before the floods and cataclysms that Mesopotamia and India and Mesoamerica all remember, and if survivors of that catastrophe scattered across the world carrying fragments of preserved knowledge, then the pattern of 7 teachers appearing in multiple isolated civilizations would reflect not coincidence and not contact, but common ancestry from a parent tradition now lost. This hypothesis explains the evidence but cannot be proven with current data, and it ventures into territory that makes professional scholars understandably uncomfortable. What we can say with confidence is that the pattern exists, and that conventional explanations for it remain incomplete. We have travelled from Mesopotamia through Egypt and India and across the ocean to the Americas, and in each location we have found cultures describing the same structure. Beings who were not fully human, bringing complete civilizational knowledge to peoples who preserved it after the teachers departed, floods marking the transition between ages of greater and lesser capacity, the number 7 appearing with suspicious consistency, and an emphasis on inheritance rather than invention that shapes how each culture understood its own achievements. The pattern is too consistent to ignore and too widespread to explain through local mythological invention. Something lies behind these traditions, some historical memory, or some universal human experience, or some source of being knowledge that predated the civilizations we can excavate. Having established that this pattern spans the ancient world, crossing barriers of ocean and language and time that should have prevented any connection, we must now turn to the question of content. What specifically did these teacher figures deliver that was considered so essential, so foundational that cultures separated by everything geography could impose remembered the same categories of knowledge as gifts from beyond human origin? The curriculum of the sages awaits examination, and what we find there may explain why the memory of their teaching persisted for millennia after the teachers themselves departed. If we accept for the purposes of examination that multiple ancient civilizations independently described receiving their foundational knowledge from beings who are not fully human, beings who arrived bearing gifts of wisdom and departed after their teaching mission was complete, then a question emerges that proves remarkably useful for testing the coherence of these traditions. What specifically did these teachers deliver? And do the various accounts agree on the content of the curriculum? The answer, when we examine the evidence carefully, is that they agree with a consistency that should not exist if these were purely independent mythological inventions designed to explain cultural achievements. Across Mesopotamia and Egypt and India and Mesoamerica, the categories of knowledge attributed to the primordial teachers are not merely similar in their general outlines but specific in their details, forming what appears to be a coherent civilizational package rather than a random assortment of useful skills. The first and perhaps most fundamental category is the measurement of time, not simply the marking of days and seasons that any agricultural society would develop through necessity, but the precise mathematical tracking of celestial cycles across spans of time that far exceed individual human lifespans. Every civilization we have examined attributed to its primordial teachers the knowledge of calendars that operate on multiple interlocking levels: lunar calendars tracking the phases of the moon, solar calendars tracking the journey of the sun through the year, and longer cycles that measure time across centuries and millennia. The Sumerians developed a calendar based on their sexagesimal mathematics that divided the year into 12 months of 30 days each, with corrections to account for the discrepancy between this idealized system and the actual movements of sun and moon. The Egyptians maintained multiple calendars simultaneously, a civil calendar of 365 days and a lunar calendar for religious purposes, and their astronomical ceilings in temples and tombs recorded the movements of stars and planets with precision that implies systematic observation over generations. The Vedic calendar of India tracks complex cycles including the 60-year Jupiter cycle and vast cosmic periods called yugas that measure time in millions of years. The Maya long count tracked time across a span of over 5,000 years, with the beginning point set to a date that corresponds to 3114 BCE in our reckoning, an era before the Maya civilization as archaeologically documented had begun. But what makes the calendrical knowledge truly remarkable is the evidence for understanding of precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the positions of stars relative to the equinoxes to shift over a cycle of approximately 2520 years. This cycle is so long that detecting it requires comparing stellar observations separated by centuries, and fully understanding it requires observations spanning millennia. Yet evidence for precessional knowledge appears in the astronomical alignments of Egyptian monuments, in the Vedic concept of the Great Year, in the Maya understanding of world ages, and possibly in Mesopotamian astronomical tablets. If this knowledge was independently discovered by each civilization, we must explain how cultures lasting centuries or at most a few millennia could accumulate observational data spanning tens of thousands of years. If it was inherited from a common source, the source must have existed long enough to make those observations. The second category is sacred architecture, the construction of temples and monuments aligned to astronomical phenomena with mathematical precision that continues to impress modern engineers and astronomers. the Great Pyramid of Giza aligns to true north with an accuracy of less than 1/10 of a degree, an achievement that required sophisticated surveying techniques and precise understanding of the relationship between terrestrial and celestial coordinates. The internal shafts of the pyramid point towards specific stars that occupied significant positions during the era of construction, and the proportions of the structure encode mathematical relationships including pi and the golden ratio with precision that some researchers argue cannot be coincidental. Angkor Wat in Cambodia, though constructed in the 12th century CE, encodes processional measurements in its dimensions and aligns with the spring equinox sunrise in ways that connect it to much older astronomical traditions. Stonehenge in Britain, constructed in phases spanning from approximately 3000 to 2000 BCE, functions as an astronomical observatory marking solstices and lunar cycles with arrangements of massive stones transported from quarries more than 100 miles distant. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia were oriented to cardinal directions and served as platforms for astronomical observation, with each level corresponding to a planetary sphere in the Babylonian cosmic hierarchy. The techniques used to construct these monuments remain subjects of debate among engineers and archaeologists. The movement and placement of stones weighing hundreds of tons, the precision of alignment achieved without modern instruments, the mathematical sophistication encoded in proportions and orientations, all of this suggests systematic knowledge that appears in the archaeological records without the expected developmental sequence. The monuments are not crude precursors evolving towards sophistication. They are sophisticated from the beginning, and the traditions uniformly attribute their design principles to the primordial teachers rather than to generations of human experimentation. The third category is writing and record keeping, the systems, that allowed complex thought to be preserved across time and transmitted beyond the limits of individual memory. We have already observed that cuneiform appears in the archaeological record already systematic, with over 1,000 distinct signs capable of representing syllables and words and abstract concepts. Egyptian hieroglyphics present the same pattern, appearing in their earliest attested forms as a fully developed system capable of expressing grammatical complexity and phonetic detail without the expected precursor stages of simple pictographs evolving toward abstract signs. The Indus Valley script, still undeciphered after a century of scholarly effort, appears in the archaeological record around 2600 BCE on seals and tablets, complete and systematic, with no visible developmental sequence. Mesoamerican writing systems, though emerging later in the record, demonstrate the same pattern of sophistication without obvious precursors. The traditions explain this pattern consistently. Writing was not invented through gradual human effort, but delivered by beings who already knew it, taught to humanity as a complete system for preserving knowledge that would otherwise be lost to the limitations of mortal memory. The fourth category is medicine and healing, the systematic understanding of human anatomy, disease process, and therapeutic interventions that appears in ancient texts with detail that sometimes surprises modern physicians. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, an Egyptian surgical text dating to approximately 1600 BCE, but copied from sources substantially older, describes the examination and treatment of traumatic injuries with clinical precision that reads like a modern case file. The text moves systematically through the body from head to toe, describing injuries, diagnostic procedures, and treatment protocols with a rationality that contains minimal magical or religious content. Mesopotamian medical tablets preserved in Ashurbanipal's library describe diseases in terms of observable symptoms and prescribe treatments based on the properties of hundreds of plant, mineral, and animal substances. The Ayurvedic texts of India present a complete medical system, including anatomy, physiology, pathology, diagnosis, and treatment, with categories and concepts that continue to guide Indian medical practice for thousands of years. And across the ancient world, from Peru to France to China, we find evidence of trepanation, the surgical opening of the skull performed with techniques refined enough that many patients survived and their skulls healed. The medical knowledge was attributed uniformly to divine or semi-divine sources, taught by beings who understood the human body and its malfunctions in ways that early human societies could not have developed through unaided observation. The fifth category is agriculture and hydraulics, the techniques that allowed human beings to transition from hunting and gathering to settled farming and from small bands to concentrated populations. The Neolithic Revolution, as archaeologists call this transition, occurred with remarkable speed in evolutionary terms, transforming human existence across multiple regions of the world within a few millennia. The domestication of plants and animals that had never before been cultivated, the development of irrigation systems that allowed farming in regions where rainfall alone was insufficient, the storage and processing of grain that enabled populations to survive seasons of scarcity, all of this knowledge appears in the archaeological record, without the gradual development we would expect if it emerged through slow trial and error. The traditional explanation is that the knowledge was taught, that beings who already understood agriculture delivered it to populations who had never practiced it, and that the gift came complete with the techniques necessary for success, rather than as a set of principles to be discovered through generations of failure. The hydraulic engineering of ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and the Andes demonstrates sophistication that should have required extensive experimentation to develop, yet the irrigation systems appear in each region already functional, already capable of supporting the urban populations that would build civilizations on their productive surplus. The sixth category is law and governance, the principles by which human societies organize themselves beyond the scale of kinship and personal relationship. The Code of Ur-Nammu, dating to approximately 2100 BCE, represents the oldest surviving legal code, but its sophistication suggests that the principles it codifies had developed over substantial prior periods. The code addresses property rights, contract obligations, family law, and criminal penalties with a systematic comprehensiveness that implies mature legal thinking. Egyptian Ma'at, the cosmic principle of truth, justice, and order, provided the conceptual foundation for governance throughout the pharaonic period, attributed to the gods themselves and maintained by human rulers as a sacred trust. The Vedic concept of dharma, cosmic law and individual duty, structured Indian society across millennia with stability that suggests the principles were not experimental innovations but received truths. The remarkable consistency of legal concepts across ancient civilizations, including the protection of property, the enforcement of contracts, the regulation of family relationships, and the distinction between intentional and accidental harm, suggests either convergent evolution of identical solutions to identical problems, or transmission from a common source that predated the divergence of the cultures we can document. The seventh category is cosmology and meaning, the narratives that explained human existence and located it within a cosmic framework of purpose and significance. We have already observed the remarkable similarities among creation narratives and flood traditions across cultures that should have developed independently. These similarities extend to concepts of the afterlife, moral frameworks governing human behavior, and the relationship between the human and divine realms. The idea of a golden age in the past, an era of greater closeness between humans and gods, appears in Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Indian, Greek, and Mesoamerican traditions with structural parallels that cannot be explained by documented contact. The concept of cyclical time, ages of creation and destruction succeeding one another in ordered sequence, appears in Hindu yugas and Mesoamerican world ages and Mesopotamian pre-flood and post-flood eras. The notion that humans exist in a diminished state, separated from divine presence by catastrophe and decline, pervades traditions that developed in isolation from one another. These seven categories do not stand alone as independent gifts bestowed in random sequence. They form an integrated system in which each element supports and requires the others. Calendars enable agriculture by indicating when to plant and harvest. Agriculture enables surplus, which enables population concentration. Population concentration requires administration, which requires record keeping. Record keeping enables the accumulation of astronomical observations, which refines the calendar. Architecture provides structures for administration, storage, and astronomical observation. Law provides the framework for managing complex social relationships that emerge when population exceeds the scale of face-to-face community. Medicine maintains the population that the entire system depends upon. Cosmology provides the meaning that motivates participation in the system and the moral framework that allows cooperation among strangers. This is not a random collection of useful skills. This is a civilization package, an integrated suite of knowledge that functions as a whole and that transforms the societies that receive it from small-scale bands into complex urban cultures capable of monumental construction and systematic inquiry. The traditions consistently describe it as delivered rather than developed, received rather than discovered. inherited from beings who possessed it complete before they began their teaching mission. We have examined what was taught with as much specificity as the sources allow. The curriculum is consistent across cultures and comprehensive in its scope. It is difficult to explain this consistency through coincidence alone, and the integration of the categories suggests deliberate design rather than gradual accumulation. But one question remains that the traditions also address with disturbing consistency. If the teachers came bearing these gifts, if they taught humanity what it needed to know, why did they leave? Every tradition we have examined describes not just arrival and teaching, but departure, withdrawal, absence. The teachers came, they taught, and then they were gone, leaving humanity to preserve what it had received without the ongoing presence of those who had delivered it. The reasons for this departure, and what it meant for the civilizations left behind, form the subject we must now examine. Every tradition we have examined shares a feature that distinguishes these accounts from ordinary mythology and that gives them their particular weight of melancholy. The teachers do not remain. They arrive bearing knowledge, they transmit what humanity needs to survive and flourish, and then they depart, withdrawing from the world they have transformed and leaving their students to preserve what they received without the continuing presence of those who understood it fully. This is not the pattern we expect from creation myths or cultural hero narratives. Gods who create the world typically remain to govern it. Heroes who establish civilizations typically die within them and are buried in tombs that become sites of veneration. But the Hor, 7 beings who appear across these traditions, do something else entirely. They complete their mission and they leave, returning to the waters from which they came, or crossing the ocean toward distant shores, or ascending to the stars where they can still be seen but no longer approached. The departure is not death. It is not defeat. It is withdrawal, deliberate and complete, and the civilizations left behind must learn to function without the teachers who made their existence possible. In Mesopotamia, the Apkallu returned to the sea at the end of each day during their teaching period. But after the flood, they ceased to appear in their original form entirely. Babylonian texts distinguish between the pure Apkallu of the antediluvian age, beings who were fully divine and who taught directly, and the later Apkallu of the post-flood era, who were part human and whose teaching was already mediated by their mixed nature. The first category of pure sages ended with the flood. What came after was different. Human priests dressed in fish cloaks performing rituals that imitated the original teachers, scribes copying tablets that preserved the original knowledge, temples built according to plans that claimed derivation from the age before the waters rose. The direct transmission was over. What remained was inheritance, preservation, the attempt to maintain through institutional effort what had once flowed freely from living sources. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl departs across the Eastern Ocean, sailing toward the direction from which he came, promising to return in a future age, but leaving the present age to manage without him. The Aztecs who received the Spanish conquistadors in 1519 initially wondered whether the bearded strangers arriving from the east represented the fulfillment of this promise, a moment of tragic confusion that contributed to their destruction. The departure had been so long ago, and the promise of return had been preserved so faithfully that recognition seemed possible even after centuries of absence. In India, the 7 rishis complete their earthly mission and ascend to the heavens, where they become the 7 stars of Ursa Major, circling the pole star eternally, visible every night to anyone who looks up but no longer walking among the people they once taught. In Egypt, the Shemsu Hor fade from the record as human dynasties take their place, remembered in king lists and temple inscriptions but no longer active participants in the governance of the land they helped to establish. The pattern is consistent: presence, teaching, departure, absence. The flood serves as the transition point in nearly every tradition, the moment when the world changes from one mode of operation to another. We have already observed the flood narratives in Mesopotamia and India and Mesoamerica, the stories of waters rising to destroy an earlier world and survivors preserving knowledge through the catastrophe. But what the flood represents in these traditions is not simply destruction, it is transformation, the boundary between an age when direct divine presence was normal and an age when such presence became exceptional and eventually impossible. Before the flood, the Apkallu taught openly. After the flood, humans must rely on what was preserved through the catastrophe. Before the flood, the reign lengths of kings stretched across tens of thousands of years. After the flood, reigns shrink to human scale. Before the flood, heaven and earth were connected by ongoing commerce. After the flood, the connection attenuates, the distance increases, and what was once directly perceived must now be laboriously maintained through text and ritual and institutional effort. The flood is not punishment for human wickedness in the way later traditions would reframe it. The Mesopotamian accounts, the oldest we possess, describe the flood as a response to human noise and proliferation, to the clamour of a population that had grown beyond manageable scale. The gods could not sleep because humanity had become too numerous and too loud. The solution was reduction, reset, a new beginning with different parameters. And when the waters receded and civilization rebuilt, the terms had changed. The teachers did not return to active presence. The age of direct instruction was over. What emerged instead was the priesthood, the institutional structure that would mediate between human society and the divine sources it could no longer access directly. Priests in every tradition we have examined occupy a peculiar position. They are custodians of knowledge they did not originate, interpreters of texts they did not compose, performers of rituals whose full meaning was established before they were born. The priest is not a prophet receiving new revelation. The priest is a guardian of old revelation, preserving what was given in an earlier age against the erosion of time and the fading of memory. The temple becomes a repository, a fortress against forgetting, a place where the patterns established by the original teachers are maintained through repetition and replication. When Mesopotamian priests dressed in fish cloaks and performed rituals imitating the Apkallu, they were not claiming to be the sages themselves. They were claiming descent from the sages, legitimacy derived from connection to sources that no longer spoke directly, authority inherited rather than received fresh. The scribes who copied the tablets were engaged in the same project of preservation. We have already examined the colophons that describe their work, the notes recording that they copied faithfully what they did not fully understand, that they maintained texts whose meanings had become obscure because the texts were sacred, and their loss would be worse than their incomprehension. This is not the posture of a civilization confident in its ongoing revelation. This is the posture of inheritors managing decline, curating fragments against further fragmentation. The phrase that appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian inscriptions, according to the old writings, tells us everything we need to know about how authority flowed in these cultures. Authority flowed backward, toward sources in the past, toward tablets written in earlier ages, toward plans established before living memory, toward teachers who had departed and left only their records behind. A king claiming legitimacy did not claim divine appointment in the present, he claimed connection to divine establishment in the past. A priest performing ritual did not claim to improvise according to the current inspiration. He claimed to replicate according to ancient instruction. A scribe copying astronomical tables did not claim to have made the observations himself. He claimed to preserve observations made in ages before the flood by beings no longer present to confirm or correct. Libraries in this context were not simply repositories of knowledge, they were tombs for knowledge. Places where the words of the departed were laid to rest and tended by generations who would never hear new words from those sources. The great library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, with its tens of thousands of tablets gathered from across Mesopotamia, represented not the accumulation of ongoing discovery, but the preservation of inherited treasure against the threat of loss. When Ashurbanipal's scribes copied tablets from earlier periods, they were engaged in the same project that Egyptian priests pursued when they carved the building texts of Edfu, the same project that Indian Brahmins pursued when they memorized Vedic hymns with techniques designed to prevent any change across generations, the same project that Maya scribes pursued when they painted codices reproducing calendrical calculations from earlier ages. All of them were fighting the same enemy, forgetting. The forgetting progressed in stages that we can reconstruct from the evidence. The first generation after the teachers, departed would have possessed living memory, people who had themselves been taught, or who had known those who were taught, for whom the knowledge was fresh and its source was recent. The second generation would have possessed transmitted memory, people who had heard from parents and teachers what the original teaching contained, for whom the knowledge was one step removed from its source, but still vital and connected. The third generation would have possessed textual memory, people who had to rely on written records because the chain of living transmission had grown too long for direct recollection, for whom the knowledge was preserved in form but increasingly opaque in meaning. Beyond the third generation, memory becomes archaeological, recoverable only through deliberate excavation of what earlier generations left behind, fragmentary and decontextualized and subject to interpretation by people who never knew the original sources, and cannot consult them for clarification. We are in this final stage. What we possess is what survived. Texts that crossed centuries and millennia, copied and recopied until the age of printing and then, of digital preservation, fixed them against further change. Monuments that resisted weather and war and the slow, patient dissolution of time. Calendars that continued in use because they worked, embedding ancient calculations in modern life every time we count 60 seconds to a minute or 60 minutes to an hour. Patterns that remained visible to anyone who looked with attention at the structures left behind. The survival is remarkable when we consider the forces arrayed against it. Libraries burned, cities fell, languages died, peoples were conquered and dispersed and absorbed into successor cultures that cared nothing for what the conquered had known. Yet the texts persisted, hidden in desert sands or buried in collapsed temples, or preserved in traditions that valued exact transmission above creative adaptation. The monuments persisted, too massive to be easily destroyed, too enigmatic to be entirely ignored, standing as questions that each generation had to answer for itself. And the patterns persisted, the 7 sages appearing in tradition after tradition, the flood marking the boundary between ages, the inheritance posture defining how civilizations understood their own achievements. We might ask whether this persistence represents accident or design, whether the survival of these traditions across such spans of time is remarkable coincidence or evidence that the original teachers intended their knowledge to last. The promise of return that appears in multiple traditions suggests the latter. Quetzalcoatl promised to come back. The Vedic texts predict that the Satya Yuga will return after the current age of darkness completes its cycle. The Egyptian texts describe the restoration of Zep Tepi the first time, when Ma'at will be re-established in its original purity. These are not simply hopes expressed by people longing for a lost golden age. They are structural features of the narratives themselves, predictions embedded in the original teaching about how the cosmic cycles would unfold. If the teachers knew enough to predict the cycles, they presumably knew that their teaching would need to survive those cycles to be available when the time came for its restoration. The archaeological record provides a strange confirmation of what the texts describe. When we dig beneath the foundations of ancient cities, we find earlier foundations, older structures, built with sophistication that does not diminish as we go deeper. We find knowledge systems that appear without visible developmental stages, writing and mathematics and astronomy, that seem to arrive already complete. We find the inheritance pattern not as mythology to be interpreted, but as stratigraphy to be measured. Layer after layer of civilization building on what came before, maintaining patterns that originated before the builders themselves could remember. This is not proof that the 7 beings existed in literal form or that the traditions preserve accurate history of actual events. It is observation that the pattern the traditions describe, inheritance rather than invention, preservation rather than innovation, authority flowing backward toward ancient sources, matches what the ground actually reveals when we excavate it carefully. The traditions may be mythology, but they are mythology that corresponds to something real about how ancient civilizations understood themselves and how the archaeological record actually presents their development. We have followed 7 chapters across 7 traditions, tracing the appearance of 7 beings who brought the knowledge that made civilization possible and then departed, leaving humanity to preserve what it had received. The pattern has held through Mesopotamia and Egypt and India and Mesoamerica, across oceans and millennia, in cultures that had no documented contact during their formative periods. We have examined what was taught and found it consistent, a civilizational package of integrated knowledge that transformed the societies that received it. We have examined the departure and found it consistent as well, withdrawal, absence, the end of direct teaching, and the beginning of institutional preservation. Now we must sit with what this means, not rushing to conclusions that the evidence cannot support, but also not dismissing what the evidence suggests simply because it fits uncomfortably with the model of human development we have been taught to expect. The pattern exists. The question is what made it. We have now travelled across the ancient world from Mesopotamia through Egypt and India to the Americas, tracing a pattern that appears with consistency that demands explanation, even if it resists definitive resolution. Before we conclude, we must sit with the question that has been implicit throughout this journey. What does the pattern mean? And what are we permitted to conclude from evidence that points in directions our standard models of human development do not easily accommodate? the mainstream scholarly position offers one answer, and it is an answer that explains much of what we have observed while dismissing certain features of the evidence as unworthy of serious consideration. According to this view, which represents the consensus of professional archaeology and anthropology, human civilization developed through cultural evolution, a gradual process of increasing social complexity driven by environmental pressures and population growth and the accumulation of technological innovations over generations. Religion in this framework serves as the mechanism by which societies organize themselves at scales beyond kinship, providing shared narratives that justified hierarchy and coordinated collective labor. Mythology encodes psychological needs and social functions, explaining natural phenomena and legitimating power structures through stories that are not meant to be taken literally. The 7 sages who appear across these traditions are not persons but personifications, symbolic figures representing the civilizing process itself, given narrative form because human minds process information through story more effectively than through abstraction. The consistency of the pattern across cultures reflects not common origin but common humanity. People everywhere face similar challenges, develop similar solutions, and encode their achievements in similar mythological frameworks because human psychology and social organization follow predictable patterns. This interpretation has the advantage of requiring no extraordinary claims. It explains the evidence through processes we can observe operating in the present, through mechanisms that are testable and falsifiable, through theories that have been refined over more than a century of professional scholarship. It is the interpretation that any responsible scholar must take as the default position, the null hypothesis against which alternative explanations must be measured, but it has difficulties that its proponents tend to minimize rather than address directly. Why is the consistency so specific? If the 7 sages are independent inventions arising from common psychological needs, why do they appear in precisely the same number across cultures that had no documented contact? 7 is not a universal number in mythology. Many cultures organize their pantheons around 3 or 12 or 4 or 9. The recurrence of specifically 7 teachers of specifically civilizational knowledge in specifically the foundational layer of specifically literate cultures separated by ocean and millennia requires more than a gesture toward universal archetypes. Why is the tone so administrative? Mythology typically reads as mythology, as poetry and narrative and dramatic conflict between supernatural beings, but the texts we have, examined often read as bureaucracy, as lists and catalogues and administrative records, as the kind of documentation produced by institutions rather than storytellers. The Sumerian king list records the reigns of pre-flood rulers with the same dry precision it applies to historical dynasties. The Bit-Mesri incantations list the teachings of the Apkallu as a curriculum rather than a legend. The Vedic tradition insists on exact preservation of syllable and accent, as though the texts were technical manuals whose efficacy depends on precision, rather than poems whose beauty could survive paraphrase. If these were purely mythological constructions, why do they so often adopt the formal characteristics of practical documentation? Why is the flood so universal as a transition marker? Floods occur in many regions, and flood myths appear in many cultures, but the specific use of the flood as the boundary between a prior age of divine presence and a subsequent age of human inheritance appears, with remarkable consistency across traditions that should have developed independently. The Mesopotamian flood divides the age of the Apkallu from the age of human kingship. The Vedic flood marks the transition between Yugas and the preservation of knowledge by Manu. The Mesoamerican floods end previous world ages and establish the conditions for the current creation. If these are independent myths arising from local flood experiences, why do they converge on the same narrative function of marking a fundamental change in the relationship between human and divine? Why do the traditions describe inheritance rather than invention? Cultures typically take pride in their achievements. The expected mythological pattern would be to credit human ingenuity with the development of civilization, to celebrate the ancestors who figured out agriculture and writing and architecture through their own effort and intelligence. But the traditions we have examined consistently do the opposite. They deny human credit. They insist that what makes civilization possible was given rather than achieved, received rather than discovered, preserved rather than created. This is an unusual posture for mythology to adopt, and its consistency across cultures that valued their civilizations highly and could easily have claimed credit for them requires explanation that the standard model does not readily provide. Against this background of difficulties with the pure myth interpretation, several alternative interpretations have been proposed, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. The first alternative suggests that the 7 sages represent mythologized memories of real human elites, founders and teachers whose historical existence has been inflated through generations of retelling, until ordinary men became divine beings and practical innovations became cosmic gifts. This interpretation preserves the possibility that something real lies behind the traditions while avoiding the extraordinary, claims required by more radical alternatives. Perhaps the founders of early Mesopotamian cities were remembered as sages. Perhaps the pioneers who developed agriculture and writing and astronomy were commemorated in traditions that gradually elevated them from human teachers to divine sources. Perhaps the number 7 represents not a single group but a composite, multiple founding figures merged into a symbolic 7 over centuries of mythological elaboration. This interpretation is reasonable and has scholarly support, but it struggles with chronological problems. The traditions place the sages before the flood, before the earliest civilizations we can archaeologically document, in an era so remote that even the first literate cultures regarded it as ancient. If the sages were founders of historical civilizations, we would expect the traditions to place them at the beginning of documented history, not in a prehistorical age separated from documented history by catastrophe. The mythologized elite's interpretation also struggles with the consistency problem. If different cultures independently elevated their own founders to sage status, why do the resulting traditions match so precisely across cultures that had no contact with each other? The second alternative proposes a lost civilization, a predecessor culture that achieved sophisticated development before being destroyed by the catastrophe that all these traditions remember. According to this interpretation, survivors of this lost civilization scattered across the world, carrying with them fragments of the knowledge they had preserved, teaching what they knew to populations that had never achieved such development on their own. The 7 sages would represent either actual survivors or memories of the lost culture personified as teaching figures. The flood was real and civilization ending, not a local event mythologized into cosmic significance, but a genuine catastrophe that destroyed an advanced culture and forced its remnants to rebuild from scratch in multiple locations. This interpretation explains the consistency of the pattern. Different cultures received the same traditions because they received them from the same source. It explains the inheritance posture. The civilizations we can document describe themselves as inheritors because they actually were inheritors, building on foundations laid by predecessors who no longer existed to claim credit. It explains the flood as transition marker. The flood was the event that destroyed the original civilization and created the conditions that produced its successor cultures. But this interpretation faces a significant difficulty. We have not found physical evidence of the lost civilization itself. If a sophisticated culture existed before the flood, where are its remains? Where are its cities, its monuments, its artifacts? The absence of such evidence does not definitively disprove the interpretation, since a catastrophe severe enough to end a civilization might also be severe enough to bury or destroy its physical traces, and since we have only excavated a tiny fraction of the places such remains might be found, but the interpretation requires us to accept the existence of something for which we have only textual evidence, and textual evidence is precisely what the mainstream interpretation dismisses as mythology. The third alternative takes the texts at face value and proposes that non-human intelligences actually taught the foundations of human civilization. In this interpretation, the fish-cloaked Apkallu emerging from the Persian Gulf, the feathered serpent arriving from across the Eastern Sea, the divine beings descending from the stars to deliver the Vedas, all of these represent not metaphors or memories but descriptions of actual events involving entities that were not human in origin. Whether these entities were extraterrestrial, visiting from other planets, or interdimensional, entering our reality from parallel realms, or something else entirely that our categories cannot accommodate, the texts describe real contact with real beings who really taught what the traditions claim they taught. This interpretation has the advantage of taking seriously what the texts actually say, of not assuming from the outset that ancient peoples were incapable of accurately describing their own experiences, but it requires extraordinary claims that our current understanding of physics and biology cannot easily accommodate, and it ventures into territory where professional scholarship cannot follow, without abandoning the methodological constraints that define serious inquiry. The ancient astronaut theories popularized by Erich von Däniken and Zecharia Sitchin and their successors fall into this category, and they have been justly criticized for misrepresenting archaeological evidence, mistranslating ancient texts, and constructing sensationalist narratives that tell modern audiences what they want to hear rather than what the evidence supports. The criticism is often warranted, but the existence of irresponsible proponents does not automatically invalidate the underlying question. The texts do describe non-human teachers. The traditions do preserve these descriptions with remarkable consistency across cultures. The question of what lies behind these traditions remains legitimate, even if many who have addressed it have done so badly. There is a fourth position that I want to suggest, not as a solution but as a stance: preserved uncertainty. We do not know what happened. The texts describe something and the pattern is real, even if the cause remains unknown. The consistency exists whether or not we can explain it. The traditions say what they say whether or not we can verify them. We are permitted to hold the question open, to acknowledge that the evidence points in directions we cannot currently follow, to admit that our models may be incomplete without claiming to know what is missing. This position may seem unsatisfying, a refusal to conclude, an evasion of the responsibility to interpret, but it has the virtue of honesty. The evidence does not permit certainty. The mainstream interpretation requires us to dismiss significant features of the traditions as relevant. The alternative interpretations require us to accept claims that outrun our evidence. The position of preserved uncertainty acknowledges what we actually know, which is less than any of the confident interpretations pretend. What remains constant across all interpretations is a set of observations that no interpretation has successfully explained away. Something was transmitted. Across cultures and millennia, sophisticated knowledge appeared in ways that do not match the expected patterns of gradual development. This transmission was treated as sacred. The cultures that received the knowledge organized themselves around preserving it, copying texts they did not fully understand, building temples according to plans they attributed to ancient sources, maintaining rituals whose meanings had become obscure but whose forms could not be changed. Human civilizations understood themselves as built on received foundations. The inheritance posture is not a minor feature of isolated traditions, but a fundamental orientation that shaped how ancient peoples understood their relationship to knowledge and authority. The age of direct contact ended. Whatever the traditions describe, they describe it as past, as something that was once present and is now absent, as a relationship that once existed and exists no longer. We can list what the evidence actually shows without pretending to explain it fully. Sophisticated knowledge appearing in the earliest accessible layers of literate civilizations, already systematic, already capable of complex expression, without the expected developmental stages that our models predict. Consistent global patterns in mythology that cross barriers of ocean and language and time, converging on the same structures and the same numbers and the same narrative sequences in cultures that had no documented contact during the formative periods. Administrative rather than poetic documentation of traditions we would expect to be mythological, recorded with the precision and formulaic repetition of practical manuals rather than the creativity and variation of oral literature. Flood tradition as universal transition marker between an age of greater presence and an age of diminished capacity, across cultures whose local flood experiences should not have produced identical narrative functions. 7 as the recurring organizational number for primordial teachers, too specific to be coincidence, too consistent to be independent invention, too widespread to be explained by diffusion alone. We can also list what we cannot prove: the identity of the teachers, whether they were mythological constructions or historical persons or something else, entirely. The mechanism of transmission, whether through cultural contact or common inheritance or processes we have not yet identified. The reason for their departure, whether the withdrawal was voluntary or forced, gradual or sudden, permanent or temporary. The literal truth of any specific text, since even the most carefully preserved tradition has passed through millennia of transmission that may have altered what was originally recorded. But we can ask questions that the evidence invites even if it does not answer them. Why do humans across so many cultures remember a time before inheritance? An era when knowledge was not preserved but delivered, when teachers were present rather than absent? Why does authority flow backward in these traditions toward sources in the past rather than innovations in the present, toward foundations rather than developments? Why does every civilization we have examined describe a golden age now lost? An era of greater capacity and closer connection to cosmic sources, a condition that the present does not match and can only remember. And what would it mean if they were right? What would it mean if the earliest civilizations understood themselves accurately, if they were correct that their knowledge was inherited rather than invented, if the pattern we have traced reflects not mythology, but memory of something that actually happened before the flood and before the forgetting and before the long centuries of preservation that have brought fragments of the original knowledge down to us? The question is not whether to believe. Belief is not the appropriate response to evidence that permits multiple interpretations. The question is what to do with what remains, how to sit with uncertainty that cannot be comfortably resolved, how to take seriously both the pattern and our inability to explain it, how to ask questions that the evidence demands without pretending to answers that the evidence does not support. We have one chapter, remaining, a conclusion that will not conclude, a final reflection on what it means to inherit traditions that describe themselves as inheritance, to study texts that insist they were not composed but received, to excavate foundations that claim to rest on deeper foundations we have not yet reached. The 7 beings remain as they have always remained, present in the traditions, absent from the world, their teaching preserved, their identity unknown, their departure unexplained, their promise of return unfulfilled. What we do with that inheritance is the only question that remains within our power to answer. In the basement of the British Museum, in climate-controlled storage facilities that maintain constant temperature and humidity to prevent further deterioration, there sit thousands of clay tablets that have never been translated. They were excavated over a century ago from the ruins of Mesopotamian cities, catalogued and numbered, and placed in drawers where they have remained. Ever since, their cuneiform inscriptions unread, their contents unknown, their messages waiting. Similar collections exist in museums across the world, in Berlin and Philadelphia, and Istanbul and Baghdad, in university archives and private collections, tablets by the tens of thousands preserving words that were pressed into wet clay 4,000 years ago, by scribes who believed they were performing sacred work, who copied what earlier scribes had copied, who maintained chains of transmission they understood as reaching back to the age of the 7 sages themselves. We do not know what these unread tablets contain. They may hold administrative records of no particular significance, grain distributions and labour assignments, and the mundane paperwork of ancient bureaucracy. Or they may hold texts that would transform our understanding of what the ancients knew and how they knew it, fragments of the curriculum that the traditions insist was delivered rather than developed. They sit in darkness, having survived fire and flood and the collapse of empires and the long patient work of time, waiting for someone to read them, waiting for the transmission to continue, waiting as they have waited for more than a century, while scholars with limited time and funding work through the backlog one tablet at a time. The messages were sent. They have not yet been fully received. And every year, more tablets emerge from excavations that continue despite war and instability and the inadequacy of resources, adding to collections that are already too large for the available translators to process in any foreseeable time frame. We are inheritors who have not yet inventoried our inheritance. We do not know what we have been given. What we do know is that the inheritance shapes our lives in ways we rarely notice. When you check the time and see that the hour contains 60 minutes and the minute contains 60 seconds, you're using Sumerian mathematics, the base 60 system that appeared, in Mesopotamia already sophisticated, without visible developmental stages, attributed by the traditions to knowledge delivered before the flood. When you measure angles and find that the circle contains 3 degrees, you are using Babylonian astronomy, the division of the heavens into a system that allowed ancient observers to track the movements of planets with precision we still respect. When you look at the night sky and see Orion the Hunter, or the Great Bear or the Scorpion, you are using constellation names that descend from cultures who tracked these patterns millennia ago, who divided the sky into figures that have persisted through language changes and cultural transformations and the rise and fall of every civilization that has used them since. The very tools we use to question the past are themselves inheritances from the past, products of the transmission we are investigating, shaped by the same sources we are trying to understand. We cannot step outside the inheritance to examine it objectively. We can only use what we have been given to study what we have been given, inheritors examining our inheritance with instruments that are part of what was inherited. The ancient scribes understood this predicament, even if they lacked our vocabulary for describing it. They copied what they did not fully understand because understanding was not the criterion for preservation. The tablets were sacred not because the scribes grasped their complete meaning, but because the tablets came from sources the scribes recognized as authoritative, from ages when teachers were present who no longer spoke, from a chain of transmission that could not be allowed to break. Preservation was the imperative. Comprehension could wait, and so they copied, generation after generation, maintaining texts whose purposes had become obscure, maintaining rituals whose original functions had been forgotten, maintaining architectural plans and astronomical tables and medical procedures because these things had been given, and the giving conferred an obligation that did not depend on the recipient's understanding. We have received what they preserved. We are links in the chain they maintained. What we do with the inheritance is our choice, but the existence of the inheritance is not something we chose. It was given to us by people who received it from others, who received it from others still, backward through time until the chain disappears into ages we cannot document and sources we cannot identify. The forgetting that began when the teachers departed continues in our own time, and it accelerates in ways that would horrify the ancient scribes who gave their lives to preservation. Languages die each year, taking with them oral traditions that existed nowhere else, knowledge encoded in vocabulary and grammar, and ways of thinking that cannot be translated because translation requires categories the target language does not possess. Indigenous elders pass away without successors, trained in the traditions they carried, and what they knew dies with them, irretrievable, gone. Ancient sites that survived millennia of natural erosion are destroyed in months by war and development and looting. Their inscriptions smashed, their artifacts scattered, their contexts lost beyond reconstruction. Digital archives that we imagine will preserve our own knowledge for future generations depend on technologies that become obsolete within decades, on institutions that may not survive the crises that loom on every horizon, on the continued functioning of a civilization whose stability we can no longer take for granted. We are not better preservers than the ancients. We may be worse. The pattern we have traced across these hours, the 7 beings who appear in tradition after tradition bearing the same gifts and departing with the same silence, does not constitute proof of anything. Patterns can emerge from coincidence. Similar structures can arise independently from similar conditions. The human mind is prone to seeing connections that do not exist, to organizing random data into meaningful arrangements, to finding confirmation for hypotheses it already wants to believe. Recognizing the pattern does not require accepting any particular explanation for it. But the pattern is not nothing. It exists. The traditions say what they say. The consistency spans cultures that had no documented contact during their formative periods. The texts describe inheritance rather than invention, with a uniformity that demands some explanation, even if we cannot determine what explanation is correct. Patterns call for inquiry. They may not compel specific conclusions, but they do compel attention. Dismissing them because we lack the evidence to prove any particular interpretation is not skepticism but evasion, a refusal to sit with questions that discomfort us, a preference for incomplete certainty over honest uncertainty. The question is worth holding open even if we cannot close it. We understand the impulse to transmit because we share it. When the Voyager spacecraft launched in 1977 carrying golden records encoded with sounds and images representing human civilization, we were attempting exactly what the ancient scribes attempted, to send knowledge forward into a future we could not see, hoping that someone would receive it, hoping that the transmission would survive the journey, hoping that what mattered to us would matter to them. When we design warning markers for nuclear waste repositories that must communicate danger across 10,000 years to descendants whose languages and cultures we cannot predict, we face the same problem the ancients faced: how to preserve essential knowledge across spans of time that exceed any individual memory, any institutional continuity, any certainty about what the future will understand. We build archives and libraries and redundant storage systems because we understand that knowledge is fragile, that forgetting is the default, that what is not deliberately preserved will be lost. We are inheritors who have become transmitters, receiving from the past and sending to the future, occupying our moment in a chain that extends beyond our vision in both directions. The philosophical questions this raises are not merely academic. What if we are always inheritors, in every generation and every discovery? What if the distinction between discovery and recovery is illusory? What if everything we learn is something we are remembering rather than something we are finding for the first time? What if the foundations of our knowledge were laid before we could remember, by sources we cannot identify, through mechanisms we cannot trace? What if the forgetting is not an accident but a condition, the price of the distance that opened when the teachers departed, the veil that descended when direct transmission ended and institutional preservation began? What if being human means precisely this? To inherit without fully understanding, to preserve without fully grasping, to transmit without knowing whether the transmission will reach anyone capable of receiving it? These are not questions that demand answers tonight. They are questions that deserve to remain open, to accompany you as this story settles into whatever silence follows. You, listening in the darkness, wherever you are, whatever hour the clock shows in your corner of the world, are participating in something that has continued for millennia. The clay tablets that Mesopotamian scribes pressed with their styluses, and the device through which you hear these words share this moment, connected across the span of time by the simple fact of transmission attempted and received. Someone spoke, someone listened. The chain held for another link. The sages, whatever they were, sent their message forward. Through catastrophe and forgetting and the long attrition of centuries, through the collapse of the civilizations that first received their teaching and the rise of successor civilizations that inherited fragments without context, through translations and copies and interpretations that may have distorted what was originally given, something persisted. It reached the scribes who copied it. It reached the archaeologists who excavated it. It reached the scholars who translated it. And it has reached you tonight in whatever form these hours of listening have given it. If you step outside after this story ends and look up at the night sky, you may see the 7 stars that form what Western astronomy calls the Big Dipper, and what Indian tradition calls the Saptarishi, the 7 sages themselves transformed into eternal lights circling the pole star. Those same stars were visible to the Sumerians who first recorded the Apkallu. They were visible to the Egyptians who remembered the Shem-Suhor. They were visible to the Vedic poets who chanted hymns received from sources beyond human composition. They are visible to you now, if you look. The same stars, the same pattern, the same silent presence in the sky that has accompanied human civilization from its beginning to this present moment. The stars do not answer questions, they only raise them. They remind us that the cosmos extends beyond our understanding, that patterns exist at scales we cannot fully grasp, that the same lights that guided ancient observers continue to shine on observers who have forgotten what the ancients knew. What were they trying to tell us, those who first named the stars after the sages? What connection were they marking between the teachers who departed and the lights that remained? We do not know, we may never know, but the question persists as the stars persist, as the tablets persist in their basement storage waiting to be read, as the traditions persist despite every force that has worked to erase them. The ancient texts reveal 7 beings who built civilization, or perhaps they reveal something stranger still, not the identity of the builders, but the nature of the building, not who the teachers were, but what it means to be taught, not the answers to questions about the past, but the persistence of questioning across every generation that has received the inheritance and wondered where it came from. We have always known, somewhere in the human memory, that we did not begin this ourselves. We have always sensed that the foundations were laid before we arrived to build upon them. We have always felt the weight of inheritance, the obligation to preserve what we did not create, the haunting suspicion that what we call discovery is only the recovery of what was known and forgotten and known again. The scribes who copied tablets they did not understand were asking the same questions we ask tonight. What must be preserved? What must never be forgotten? What do we owe to those who sent knowledge forward to reach us in our moment of receiving? We cannot answer for them. We can only decide how we will answer, for ourselves. The transmission continues, or it ends. The chain holds for another link, or it breaks. The inheritance passes to the next generation, or it is lost. These are not abstract possibilities. They are choices we make with our attention and our resources, and our willingness to hold open questions that resist closure. The 7 sages departed long ago, if they ever arrived at all. What they left behind is what we have. What we do with it is the only legacy we control, and somewhere in the darkness, wherever you are listening, the stars continue their slow rotation around the pole, the same stars. The same silence, the same unanswered question that has accompanied every inheritor since the first scribe pressed the first wedge into the first clay tablet and hoped that someone, someday, would understand.